In Defense of Harriet, Part 2.
Hello and welcome to SnarkSquad Pod, a media podcast full of friendship, feelings, and snark. I'm Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marines.
And we are joined today by Deboki and Jocelyn.
Hi, I'm Deboki, and I am on YouTube at Okie Dokie Boki.
Hi, I am Jocelyn, also on YouTube at Yogi with a Book.
And Deboki and Jocelyn are here with us today to talk about the film adaptation of Emma, the one that came out in 2020.
Emma, period.
Emma, period.
Very important distinction.
Well, because people are probably like, didn't you do an Emma episode? And we did, friend.
We
did.
Sure did.
But Emma, period, came out in 2020. So now we got to talk about that one. And it's my job to give the plot synopsis, and I'm going to do this in as abbreviated a fashion as possible. So here we go. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich. She is the biggest fish in the small pond of Highbury. Emma's best friend and governess, Miss Taylor, gets married, and she leaves Emma to go, live with her new husband. So Emma is both in the market for a new friend and also very into the idea that she set Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston up, and she would like to play matchmaker again. Emma befriends Harriet Smith, a girl who doesn't know who her parents are, but who has been educated in Highbury. Emma soon settles on setting Harriet up with Mr. Elton, the local vicar, who is actually very clearly in love with Emma, but, she doesn't pick up on that.
I mean, in love with is a little strong. He's very clearly into Emma.
He's very clearly into himself. And then also into the idea of Emma. Harriet receives an offer of marriage from a local farmer named Mr. Martin, but Emma is so set on Harriet and Mr. Elton that she influences Harriet to turn Mr. Martin down. Mr. Elton eventually declares his feelings for Emma, but she refuses him, and he very much refuses Emma's plans for him and Harriet. Mr. Elton disappears and returns after 6 weeks with a new wife. Two new people show up in town: Jane Fairfax, who is the niece of Miss Bates, who is a local poor woman, and Frank Churchill, who is Mr. Weston's son. Emma is jealous of Jane and all her accomplishments and gets flirty with Frank. I have not mentioned him yet, but Mr. Knightley is kind of important. He's Emma's brother-in-law and a friend of the family, and he's in love with Emma. And at a ball held in Frank's honor, they do a sexy dance, and it looks like they both realize they have feelings for each other. But later, when Knightley tries to confess those feelings, they're interrupted by Frank, who saved Harriet from some, thieves on the road. I don't know. Harriet now fancies herself in love with Mr. Knightley. Emma thinks Mr. Knightley is in love with Jane. Everyone thinks Emma is in love with Frank. And surprise, Frank and Jane are actually secretly engaged. Emma takes this in good stride because she realizes that she is in love with Mr. Knightley, but also she doesn't want to hurt Harriet's feelings again. So Emma takes it upon herself to make amends with Mr. Martin and explain how she influenced Harriet. So Mr. Martin proposes to Harriet again. She accepts, leaving Knightley and Emma free to also get engaged, with the understanding that they are still going to live with Emma's dad because he's kind of needy. The end.
Okay, so as was just mentioned, we have already done an episode on Emma, but anytime we do something that is an adaptation or that is part of kind of a larger pre-existing bit of source material, we like to preempt our usual "did you like it?" with kind of general background. And since Deboki and Jocelyn were not on our previous Emma episode, I just want to ask you guys really quickly what your background is with Emma. Have you read the book, or did you come into this movie knowing nothing?
Emma is actually, I think, the first Jane Austen book that I read, but it was a long time ago, so I didn't really remember it for a long time until I had seen some of the adaptations. I think I had probably seen the Gwyneth Paltrow one, and I definitely had seen Clueless. But super recently, just in the past few months, I decided to listen to the audiobook version narrated by Juliet Stevenson, and I loved it. I was just obsessed with it. I was why have I just been ignoring Emma my whole life? Not really giving her due. So that is the bulk of my experience. It's very recent and very intense.
We are always gushing about the Rosamund Pike Pride and Prejudice, but I feel like I also should just shout out the Juliet Stevenson, Jane Austen she's dope. I love her. I love Julia Stevenson.
Great.
I bet that audiobook's actually great. I read it physically for the first time last year. I want to say maybe August or September. I think it was around BookNet Fest. But my Emma background is entirely Clueless based. I have not seen the Gwyneth Paltrow movie, but also I'm not a big fan of Gwyneth Paltrow, so I don't think I'm missing out. But big fan of Alicia Silverstone and Paul Rudd. They
yes,
yes,
so good. Donald Faison, it's all very good. I read Emma for the first time last year. It's my second Austen book I've ever read after Pride and Prejudice, but this is the only one I've ever actually known the plot really going in. I hadn't really known much about Pride and Prejudice except the names Elizabeth and Darcy. So that was an entirely new story for me. This one was not.
Jane Austen is pretty much my favorite author of all time, one of my favorites. But Emma was the last of her books that I read ever. I had read all of her other work first, but Emma is also Nicole's favorite. So sorry, I stole that from you saying that to the audience. But Emma is also Nicole's favorite. So when we planned to do the episode on it, that's when I picked up and read Emma. Super struggled with getting into it. And I was like, I don't like this. But I asked Nicole about it. I was like, why do you like this? And she explained it in a way that I was like, okay, I'm reading this wrong. And I went back and reread it and was like, okay, I love this. So since then, the Juliet Stevenson version of the audiobook is in my regular rotation of things I fall asleep listening to. And Clueless is a cinematic masterpiece. So that's where I am.
Yeah, it's really, really important that we get it on the record as many times as possible that the stance of Snark Squad Pod is that Clueless is a cinematic masterpiece. And anybody who disagrees with that is simply not allowed to express that opinion on this podcast. But yes, Emma is my favorite Jane Austen novel. I started reading Jane Austen when I was 19 or 20. And I think I read Pride and Prejudice first. And I mentioned this elsewhere, but Emma was the book that helped me understand how funny Austen is. I feel like I had an experience kind of similar to the one that you're describing, Mari, only for Jane Austen as a whole. And it wasn't that somebody else said, no, you're reading this wrong. It was reading Emma that made me get Jane Austen. She's funny. I don't know. And I just really love this book about this messy protagonist who's wrong all the time and is convinced that she's right. She keeps making the same mistakes over and over again. And I love her. So that is all of our background with Emma more broadly. So we've all read the book, which is good. We'll make for a more interesting conversation, I guess, about this as an adaptation. Nobody will be left out. But did you like this movie, Emma, period, 2020? Did you enjoy this movie?
I very much liked this. And as soon as I saw it, I emailed Deboki and Marines and I was like, hey guys, watch this please so I can yell at you about it.
And then I responded back, okay, you're on a podcast now.
Yeah, I also loved it. I've whined about this in 50 different contexts, so I apologize. This movie keeps breaking my heart. I've tried to watch it so many times and had failures with it. So when I finally got to sit down in the theater, I was worried that they were just gonna come out and be psych, you can't watch it. But they didn't do that they didn't do that to me, and I'm very relieved because I loved it. I loved the way it looked. I love the characters. I love a lot of the choices they made in terms of bringing different things to the movie that you don't get from the book, nightly butt.
Yes. We're going to circle back around on that point. Just hold on for a second. I also enjoyed it. So I ended up putting off seeing this just because things got a little bit apart from, the elephant in the room and that we're recording this all from quarantine, apart from how things have been wild in the last few weeks, that regard, things had been really busy for me. And so I put this off watching this till very much the last moment. I mean, that's the story of all the media I consume. So it's whatever.
But it got a little bit trickier when suddenly you couldn't go to a movie theater anymore.
Right. Well, yes, that's the thing is that I waited so long and that it got to a point where it was oh no, the movie theater is closed now. now. So I was kind of freaking out a little bit, but then they announced that they were going to release this early. So I spent $20 American to rent this in my home. It's fine. I had a Hershey bar that would have cost me like $10 in the movie theater anyway. So it evened out. But the whole thing was like, I was kind of scared to not like this because it had like built up so much of the same thing that Bogey is describing, where it was like almost cursed. But I sat down just now, 5 minutes before recording this, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very good. There are things that, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about, but the sum of it is that I enjoyed this. And I think even in the ways that it made interesting choices as an adaptation, it still worked kind of apart from that as a film.
I also really loved this. I had very high expectations. Like 4 different people in, I don't know, the first like couple weeks after the first trailer came out independently were like, have you seen this trailer? And I'm like, yes, the algorithm showed it to me before any of you did. But the internet knew that I needed to watch this trailer. And like, even from the trailers, I had really, really high hopes on our like previous Emma episode. And just in general, I think when we're talking about adaptations too, I've mentioned this, that I think that this is a really, really tricky book to adapt because so much is communicated through the tone and through the narration that I think that there's a way that in other Austen novels you can give some of Austen's funny lines to the characters and have it still work. I don't think that you can do that in quite the same way with Emma. It's a lot harder to communicate that kind of that tone, and part of why Clueless is a flawless film is that it does manage to like get that tone across. And like from the trailers, I felt like this was going to stick the landing, but then again, you know, there's like that hype. There's that sense of I expect so much. There's so much room for me to be disappointed. But I was not disappointed. And in fact, I absolutely loved this. So I guess the place for us to start then is to talk about this as an adaptation. Everybody's answers to Did You Like It kind of referenced like the choices that were made. So everybody liked it as a movie. And I am curious how everybody felt about it as an adaptation.
I think that the thing here, and it's kind of what you mentioned, Nicole, is like capturing the tone. And so, you know, Austen does a lot of this work in her narration. And some of that, like, the thing with Austen, I think, is that she's making a lot of commentary and she injects a lot of humor, even though her characters are going through it earnestly. A lot of times, like, she's injecting her own kind of take on what is happening through the narration. And so I think that that's probably why this is difficult to adapt, is because if you don't have that narration or if you include it or whatnot. But I think that what it did was it took that humor and it made it like the characters and just the movie a little more cheeky, which I wasn't sure if, you know, that would work or not, but it ended up working for me. I think that a lot of like the main scenes that I was excited to watch, like the dance scene and the badly done, like all of those were accounted for and also well done. So there wasn't anything that I can think of right now that I felt like was missing. Probably if like I went back to it, I would be like, oh man, you know, this one. But just from like a first pass through, like I felt like all of the big ticket items were there, or at least that the story was told in a complete fashion that, you know, I got the gist of everything that I wanted.
I think what I remember, like the one thing I remember feeling, not like I wasn't mad about it, and I don't know if it's just because like I've read the book, but it was something I was wondering like how it would have felt if I hadn't read it, is that a lot of the Frank Jane stuff felt very like, I don't know if it would have made any sense to me that they had gotten secretly engaged if I hadn't read the book, just in the way it was presented in the movie, because it was just kind of felt like those were two very, especially Jane didn't really have that much of a role in this movie, I felt like. So she, yeah, that part seemed really sudden to me. But like, I also didn't care. Like, I was just like, like, that's just a deleted scene to me, like, whatever. But I think what I really loved about it was the style of it, which is like really striking, like the colors of it, the way like the setting is all laid out, the way the costuming is done. It like has a really strong point of view of what this world looks like. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of why I love Pride and Prejudice 2005, that adaptation so much, where it just feels so committed to its own specific point of view that you really feel like you're not just being forced to like read a book like the way that, like, you know, you might have to read it in middle school. Like, you feel like you're actually saying someone's point of view about what this book might have looked like.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I think that this adaptation did a really good job of cutting the fat where it needed to be, because Emma is a chunky ass book. And for reasons that if I were editing it in modern times, like I would cut like 200 pages out. It just at the end where it's like we hear about Frank and Jane and then we read the story or the note and then someone else is reading the note next. And it's just like, no, like this does not need to be 100 pages. It just doesn't make sense.
I am not interested in reading your edit of Emma. Leave my book alone.
But for me, yeah, this took like all of the highlights. I think it did get a little zany in points. And I think most impressive for me was something that my partner actually mentioned, is that like in this current time, with Parasite being the Oscar-winning movie of the year, we have such a charismatic and like sympathetic movie about rich people just being assholes. Like, like I think that's a true testament both to what Autumn de Wilde did with like Austen's story and the story itself, of just like how it makes it very relatable, even though like these people lead very unrelatable lives.
Jocelyn, I totally agree with pretty much all of that. Like, I think, I guess not the things about cutting the book, but about this movie, I agree. Deboki, the Jane and Frank thing I thought was interesting, because I actually, that is one of my complaints, is the way that the Frank and Jane story was adapted, but to almost the exact opposite degree. While in the book, it is fairly clear that Emma is being misled by her own wishes with regards to Harriet and Mr. Elton, the book does not really tip you off to the fact that Frank and Jane are into each other. And I felt like the movie spent a lot of time showing them, like they did not have that very many scenes, but when they did have scenes, they were making eyes at each other across the room in this way that I was like, who the fuck wouldn't understand that they're into each other? That something is going on there. But I don't know, whatever. That was a fairly small complaint, but it was one of my few complaints about this as an adaptation, is that the idea that like they really got everybody, they really pulled one over on them, made no sense to me in the context of this movie. But the class stuff I thought was really, really interesting, and like really, really well done. I feel like I can't think of another sort of period romance like this that makes the servant characters as present as they were in this movie. Like they were very much there, and you were aware of what a role they played in these people's lives. And you know like having them move Mr. Woodhouse's screens back and forth, and like the bit at the end where they turn around and whatever. I thought all of that stuff was really, really interesting. It also served to really, I don't know, sell some things about the Harriet and Emma dynamic. I feel like this Harriet is the most fully realized Harriet I have seen in an Emma adaptation. I think that they did a really good job of like making that character present. And part of how they did it was by having Emma go to Mrs. Goddard's more than she does in the book. Like that is like a change to, I think in the book she only goes to look after Harriet when she gets sick. But otherwise we never really see her at Mrs. Goddard's. But seeing her in this movie, they made a point of having Emma go there, and you see the way all the girls react to Emma's presence. And like there is so much going on in this story, like in the actual source material around class. And I think that it is something that many people trying to adapt this material want to like wish away. Like they want to pretend that it's not happening, because it's much easier to just tell like a fun love story. This movie like leaned all the way into the class stuff that is happening in this story. I love the fact that they had that conversation at the end between Harriet and Emma about like who Harriet's father is, and Emma inviting them, basically inviting Harriet's merchant father over to Hartfield, which is, a construct of the movie. It is not a thing that happened in the book, but is a thing that lands. Like I think that this movie did so much legwork prior to that moment to make all of the class lines so clear that you understand the weight of Emma saying, yes, I will, like, yes, by all means, you can come over, like that it actually means something in the context of this movie that I think that it wouldn't if you hadn't also done all of the rest of the work of like setting up the very, very clear class divisions that run throughout this town and throughout this story. All of which is to say, more or less, that I agree wholeheartedly, Jocelyn. Like, I think that it was really, really interesting that they managed to make this movie about like rich people doing bad things still work. I loved also to that end, as a change of this movie, the fact that Emma had to go and make things right for Harriet. Emma had to go to Mr. Martin, and like that making her be the one to go and rectify that. I feel like that's a better journey for this character. Like that is in fact one of the few things that in this movie I was like, oh damn, I wish the book did that. That's great. But yeah, I don't know. Mariah mentioned the making the character sort of cheeky, and I think kind of related to that, hand in hand, is also a lot of the like lush visuals. And I think that all of that stems from Autumn de Wilde's background in music videos. So this is her first feature film that she's ever directed, but she has directed many music videos over the years. And so that's kind of her background. And so I think you can kind of feel that in like, there is a musicality to this movie that I think helps sell a lot of the comedic beats and whatnot. My one other sort of like tiny grievance, I don't know, thing that I have mixed feelings about is sort of like a segue into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is kind of making our way through the characters. And obviously we have to start with Anya Taylor-Joy as Emma. And I'm curious how you guys felt about her performance and about this portrayal of this character.
Ultimately, I liked it. I like the sum of all its parts. But my one big thing about this movie, and it is something that going into it, Nicole warned me, because the whole thing was that when I started reading Emma, I was like, this girl's like, she's messy. I don't like this. Like, I don't like this story. It's making me uncomfortable. She's loud and wrong. And so when I was reading, Nicole was like, well, the reason I like her is because she is messy and she gets things wrong. But she ultimately has everybody's best interest at heart. Like she in the book, it feels like she is trying to help. She's just a little naive, and she's a little self-involved in a way that also doesn't let her see the full picture. But at the same time, she's I don't know, she's acting in a way that is on behalf of others. Mm-hmm. So I started reading it that way, and I was like, oh, Emma. It was like more of that than like, you know, the like, you know, not hatred, but like the like uncomfortable feeling that I was getting. So here, I just felt like they went in a direction with Emma that was a little meaner. Actually, more than mean, because Nicole was like, she's a little meaner in this, and I don't know how that's going to work for you. So that was the warning she gave me. But more than mean, I just found her a little more like cocky and condescending in a way that like a lot of like her looks, her side-eye looks, and the ways that she deals with people, like it made those things feel mean. On the one hand, it made her arc like really significant in this movie, because she does go like a long way, considering everything that by the time that she walks over to Mr. Martin's and makes amends, you're like, wow, she went on a really big journey. But on the other hand, I think that you miss a little bit of like who Emma really is as a character when you make her that like confident, condescending, cocky, and you don't get that sense of like, what? I'm just trying to help. So it worked okay for me in the end, but what's missing here for me is a little bit of the earnestness of the characters, because you take away the layer of like the snarkiness is coming from the narration and the earnestness is coming from the characters. You put all of the snark in the characters and you miss some of that earnestness. And I think that particular thing was like most felt by me in the moment of the badly done scene when she then starts crying. I was like, I don't believe you. So like, and I don't know if that's like, that was the performance or if it was just like the culmination of everything we had seen. But in that moment, I was like, Mr. Knightley played it well. Her crying, I was like, is this supposed to be sarcastic? Because I don't believe it.
Yes, that is basically where I was going with my like lead into that question. question of like, I had a sort of, I don't know, frustration. And it was basically that I feel like she's this portrayal makes her meaner at the start. And yes, just much less good natured than I think that her book version is. But I go back and forth about whether or not that's a problem, because like, I think that we have roughly 2 hours with this character and we get to see her go on like a really complete journey for that reason. Like, because she starts out so much meaner, we get to see her like actually grow more than she does in the book, I guess. I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, where she ends in the book still very much tracks with where she starts in the movie. So I didn't really have a problem with it. I thought Anya Taylor-Joy actually did like a really great performance. And every time she was like really like snippy and holier than thou to people, I was chuckling because I was like, you're such a dick. But like, but she really sold it. And I think it does make her arc a little bit more satisfying here, because you do get to see her realize that she went too far and is actually being mean-spirited. And I don't know if we fully get that in the book, personally.
Yeah, I kind of liked that she was sort of a brat. So walking out of this movie, I realized that like there's a thing in Emma that I also see in part of like the way that I read Taylor Swift's persona, and like why I'm like a weird fan of Taylor Swift, even though I think she's not like actually necessarily, I don't know, like I don't know her as like a human being, but like there are things in her presentation that I'm always like a little bit like about. But where like that like kind of like underlying like cockiness that I like kind of respect, even though I also like don't always like where it takes that character as I'm seeing them. Like there's something about that with this Emma that I really liked, because it did make me uncomfortable, especially the scene like where she's kind of like talking shit to Jane, but then Jane like immediately shows her up and is just like, I don't need my music, bitch. Like,
yes, I did like it. I just think that overall they're not having her be like a little bit more earnest and nice, and like, I don't know, she spends a little bit more time like visiting Miss Bates and being nice to the poor and things like that might be performative, but that are still things where you're like, okay, this is why people are charmed by her. This is why Mr. Knightley loves her. There were facets of her personality that you can see, like there's a good person underneath that all, that I think that by just making her that much more like snippy and snarky, there was even a moment I was like, why does he like her? So yeah, it was fine for what it did for the arc, but it was just one thing that it felt the most different to me from previous adaptations and from the book.
Yeah, and I will also say that I agree with Jocelyn in that I loved this the performance. So separate, like I collapsed these two questions into one. Like I think that there's the question of how this character is constructed in this movie, and like how this character in this movie works as an adaptation of this book. But there's also the thread of like Anya Taylor-Joy in this role. Fantastic. She was delightful.
Yes.
I really, really enjoyed her. And I do think that she pulled off something that we talk about quite a bit with, you know, unlikable characters or characters who behave badly, that I think she did manage to successfully pull off the thing of like being sufficiently charismatic that you still are like into watching her, even when she's behaving in a way that is really, really shitty. I like, for my own heart and for my own deep, deep attachment to this character, feel a sadness at watching her be portrayed as so actively mean-spirited. But it ultimately felt like it worked in the confines of this movie, even if my Emma Woodhouse loving heart hurt a little bit to see that interpretation of her. And I guess the natural place to go from Emma is to Knightley and Knightley butt. The all important.
I will say that I found his sideburns like a little more distracting than the butt. It did almost get in the way of my appreciation of him. So I did watch the BBC adaptation recently, and like Johnny Lee Miller, right?
Yeah, Johnny Lee Miller
got like that like energy down of like the disappointed like pseudo brother kind of thing. And I think Johnny Flynn did something like he managed to get like a similar sort of vibe, but like in terms of the performance that I'm comparing to, like, he's not there, but I still loved him. And I especially love like that kind of like post-dance meltdown of his. Like that was, I thought, very compelling to watch.
Has his tantrum in his mansion.
Yes.
I mean, who hasn't?
Yeah, I really enjoyed him. One thing that really worked for me was that even though I looked up after the fact, their actual ages as actors is very similar to the characters of Knightley and Emma. They don't look that different in age. And that's always something that like was a little weird for me when I was reading it. I was like, oh, this isn't so great in the 2000s. This isn't. But I do think that they had really good chemistry. I also, like, this has nothing to do with his performance. I like that he's kind of short. I don't know, like Emma and a short Knightley like works for me.
He does have real short guy energy.
But yeah, like I think he did like the job of being the hero and like stepping up when he had to. And I think he was just a very good pairing with Anya Taylor-Joy's Emma. Like he let her shine, but I never forgot that he was in a scene. I wouldn't say that he's my favorite character or my favorite actor, but I think he really handled it skillfully, that like every time he was there, I was like, yes, this makes sense.
I was a little doubtful. I was a little hesitant, but I think it ultimately worked. That dance scene was great. And one of the things back when we were talking about this as an adaptation, it kind of made me realize that, well, I think for any adaptation and a lot of the Austen ones, there are things or moments that are add-ins that really stand out. So, you know, you have the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice and it's Mr. Darcy swimming in the lake, right? That doesn't happen, but it's like just like a moment of like every day he does this and it stands out. And like the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, there are so many moments of like the sister stuff where like, you know, Jane and Elizabeth are under the covers flailing because they just got back from the ball or whatnot. So those little moments are like always things that stick out. And here I think that Knightley had a lot of them, and just seeing him get dressed and seeing him throw his tantrum and just he was brooding a lot through a lot of this. So we get a lot of like moments with him just kind of having those feelings and stuff. And I love them. I just love those additions. I love spending that time with him. And for as much as I said earlier, like there was a moment where I was like, why does he like her? But the movie does spend time just kind of taking us through it. So by the time that you get to the dance and they've got all of that like sexual tension going on, I was sold by then in the ways that it helped correct some of that like weird stuff, like energy of like this was written by Austen many years ago. One, they didn't look so far apart in age. Two, he does like correct her and stuff, but there was a little less of that like brotherly energy, and a little bit less of like, I'm your dad's friend, and it was more like, I'm a family friend and your brother-in-law. So all those things helped.
Yeah, the dance is so good. This is the best adaptation of the Emma Knightley dance. I feel this is my favorite version of that. And I also loved, speaking of those additions, like, yes, having him run from the dance to Hartfield, that bit, amazing. I loved that,
especially because we had seen him running around the whole time, because it's like a thing that he doesn't use his carriage. So when he realizes that he has to run after the carriage, I was just like, oh my god, my heart.
Yes, it's a thing, and it's a thing that is like part of their relationship too. Like it is a thing that Emma specifically chides him for, and it's like, why aren't you being more of a gentleman? And yes, so then him having to chase this carriage down, so charming, so delightful, so good. He was the one casting choice that I was the most like, I don't know about that guy before I saw it, and then after seeing it the first time, I was like, okay, I was wrong. He is great. I am with Deboki that I feel like I still have the Johnny Lee Miller kind of like standard in my head, specifically for the badly done line. I just Johnny Lee Miller's delivery of that line, there's a shot of him where he's like thinking about, like right before he starts talking, because we see him walk up behind her, and it it reads as he is preparing this speech in his head. He's like rehearsing what he's gonna say, and I don't know. I am deeply obsessed with it. However, that unfair comparison aside, I thoroughly loved this portrayal of this character and all of the added little moments that they gave him. I think really did a lot to sell this romance.
One thing that I think that, just to add here, because I don't know where else we would talk about it, their scene that is basically like his proposal, where they're like missing each other and communicating around each other, but they're also kind of like chasing each other. And then when he finally is like, I love you, and she gets a nosebleed.
Yes.
It was so unexpected, just like Knightley butt, but it was so good. She's like freaking out so much, her nose starts bleeding, and he's like barely fazed by this. He's like, what? And like dabbing. I don't know. For some reason, that was such a weird addition that worked so well in the moment.
So good. Yes. And like it fit with the tone of this movie that like, yes, you're like, okay, yeah, of course. Fun production fact that I learned while watching so many interviews with the cast of this movie is that was written into the script that she was going to have this nosebleed, but she actually had she got a fucking nosebleed. Like that is her actual blood. Like she just, yes.
Beautiful.
I don't know. Like she just got so
Give
excited.
her an Oscar.
Whatever.
I know.
Yes. So
Man.
the other thing about the proposal scene that I thought was really interesting, I kind of already touched on this, but I had kind of my immediate book reader adaptation feelings of like, oh no, when she confesses Harriet's feelings in that moment, because it's like a thing in the book that she's like, at least that secret can like stay with me, and like I won't have to betray that trust. But then, as I have already articulated, I love everything about where they ultimately go with that choice. So like it ends up working really, really well. And so I thought, I don't know, just all around, it was really, really interesting how I feel like throughout the movie, choices were made that were like, no, we're going to do something a little bit different. And every time I had a moment of like, oh no, why are you going to do something different? I was like, oh, you were right. Yes, you correctly made something different. Good job. Yeah. I guess continuing through the characters then, Mia Goth as Harriet. How did you guys feel about this Harriet? I've already mentioned elsewhere that I loved her, but how did you guys feel about this portrayal of Harriet?
I always kind of have a hard time with Harriet. Like I never know if I really like her or not. And so I think what I at least appreciated about this movie is I think it had like a clear sense of like what her friendship with Emma was.
Yes.
And so, like kind of like what you were saying, like how they build that out more. And some of that is also like Emma's own journey of like how she sees Harriet. So I really like that overall. And I don't know in terms of the specific performance if I have any thoughts, but that was the thing I really appreciated about the movie.
Yeah, same. I don't really have many opinions on Harriet, except that she's done super dirty in the book. But I thought she was pretty good. I was also looking at people after the fact. I didn't know that she's Shia LaBeouf's ex-wife. That was weird to me, right? Yeah.
Yes, very weird.
But yeah, like I think she was fun. I also feel like, I don't know, for whatever reason, Emma looks super young and Harriet's supposed to be younger than her, but she didn't feel it fully to me. There was something weird about their energy that I was not fully buying, but I thought it was fine.
I agree with that. It just goes back to that same thing where I would have liked to feel like a little bit more earnestness in their friendship and just like see. I know I kind of feel the opposite of Nicole in that I don't feel like this was a fully realized Harriet. I think she was a little ditzier and she didn't hold her own in a way where you got the sense that why these two people were forming a friendship necessarily. Like it was almost there, it just missed a little bit of something, which is why I feel like I ultimately don't have a lot of feelings about this Harriet. Like it was fine, but it wasn't, I don't know. She's definitely not one or a performance or a character that I walked away thinking like, wow, that was the best one.
Okay, so in defense of this, Harriet, Deboki already mentioned the bits of their friendship that we get to see that I think, so this is, I think the moment of them like dancing around Emma's bedroom is to me somewhat akin to the 2005 Pride and Prejudice with them like, you know, giggling under the covers. Like, I think that we got little moments like that of their friendship that I thought were sweet and were good to see. The fact that Harriet's introduction in this movie, though, her first scene is them having tea at Hartfield, and Harriet sitting there trying to mimic, like trying to like discreetly, but not at all discreetly, trying to copy Emma's like mannerisms and movements and whatnot. Like the awkwardness of that moment charmed me so fully, so immediately, that I think like that's a huge part of why I ultimately come down like so pro this version of this character. That scene, I could have watched that scene go on for an extra 10 minutes and been perfectly satisfied. I think that it was very, very sweet, very, very well done. I also think that some of the ways that they nudged the story for this adaptation were nudges in favor of giving Harriet like a touch more agency in certain moments, like having her. So it is a change of this movie that Harriet realizes that Emma has feelings for Mr. Knightley during that whole conversation where Harriet and Emma are talking about Harriet's feelings for Mr. Knightley. And I just felt like that was played really, really well. I appreciated that we had this moment of her being like, I gave up Mr. Martin. Like the entire journey that I've been on for the last 2 hours is basically because you fucking told me to turn that guy down. And now you're coming to me to say like, now this new person that I'm in love with, you're in love with too. And like, wow, this blows. I don't know. I think that there were a lot of little moments like that I really, really appreciated.
Yeah. I mean, I like that we sort of use her as a vehicle in that way, but I feel like that's as far as she goes. So I agree. I like that she confronts Emma. I like that we get to follow her back to the school. And I think this also goes hand in hand with the fact that we were talking about earlier of like getting to see servants and like working class people on the screen and like in your face for the first time. I think all of that really works. But even still, Harriet just doesn't like shine for me.
I think we've been talking a little bit about some of the more subtle divergences of this movie. I think that as we're making our way through characters, it's worth mentioning that Phil Nighy as Mr. Woodhouse is like a meaningful divergence from the book. But how did you guys feel about him?
So I think this was hard to me. He feels consistent with the book in part because I had seen the trailers and then listened to the audiobook. And when I listened to the audiobook, I listened to it with almost like, because like even in the trailers, he's so striking as a character. Yeah. So when I was listening to it, I was just like, well, that's what it's going to be like that. I don't, they've all merged together and it just worked. Like I was like, that is the best casting. I completely see it. Like I'm here for it.
I guess to me, I would say it feels like a significant divergence because I do not buy that this man needs her there. Like this man in this movie would be just fine if she left Hartfield to go to Donwell Abbey. Like no big deal. All would be well.
He's definitely less like frail.
Yes.
And there's something, a little bit more like hearty and self-possessed about him in this movie, where that moment of like, I can't leave him. It was almost like, I mean,
you can.
I think you can. Where in other versions or like reading the book, you really do get the sense that she is like managing his day to day and his moods and everything that goes on to a point where you're like, okay, I get it.
Yeah, agreed. I think part of the reason that Emma is so obviously like, I always bought her like very easily to be like kind of terrible, but in the best way, is just like how babied she is at home, but also how much her father needs to be babied. And like Bill Nighy is I don't know, like that was the one person who, when he popped up, I was like, oh, that was the choice. Okay. Like that was the one I had to adjust to for sure, because like he's such a prominent actor. I know him from so many different things that just like seeing him on there was just such a shock. I like his interpretation, and I don't know that it fully works with how I've always interpreted Mr. Knightley, but like in the sense of this adaptation, I think it works pretty well.
Yeah, I would agree with that general sense that like I think that this is in no way the way that I think of this character, and will not change the way that I think of this character when I reread the book. But in the context of this movie, other than that one little sort of plot beat not making very much sense, I think is generally fine. And they kind of gloss over that plot beat. So that scene in the BBC version, the scene where Emma says that, oh, like, how could I ever leave him, is like, it is a whole entire scene where she storms into his house sobbing, like in hysterics, like, oh no, we can't get married because I can't ever leave my dad. And in that, it makes sense because he is much more frail. We see him like weeping whenever Isabella comes, and then he leaves and he like cries as she goes away and whatever. So they managed to make enough choices around that choice, you know, to make that sort of jive a little bit better.
He's my Mr. Woodhouse.
It's Teboki's turn to be like, in defense of.
Look, in defense, when he goes, innocence, like, I think that's what Jane Austen intended for Mr. Woodhouse.
That is a great moment.
I loved that bit.
So we spent a lot of time talking about all of kind of the major players, but there are actually a lot of characters in this novel. So are there any other characters, novel in this movie rather, are there any other characters that we have not yet discussed that you guys would like to touch on?
Frank Churchill.
Yes, Frank Churchill. Let me tell you. I mean, I don't like him. He's not a character you're necessarily supposed to like, but they like went ham on the big fuckboy energy in this movie adaptation. And I was like, what is this? I mean, again, the sum total of everything, of all the choices they made, were ones that I was like, okay, this all works together. Like, I guess a bigger fuckboy works with the energy of like the snarkier movie, but also it was to a point that, again, I was like, why does Emma like him? Yes. Why is she putting up with this? What is going on? Why does Jane like him? Like, none of that really made sense for me. He is very pretty. I don't even know who that actor is, but he was very pretty. So like, I got that. But just the mean-spiritedness and just sort of, I don't know, his whole energy did not work for me.
The fuckboy energy also makes it harder to buy, like, that everybody is so taken in by him too. Like, just all of the energy that he rides into town with is very, very confusing.
Yeah, that was the one. Like, that was the only character that I was like, okay, I actually have issue with this interpretation because that might not be my Mr. Woodhouse. Sorry, Teboki, but this is absolutely not Frank Churchill as I read him. Like I never fully bought into Emma and Frank's like quote unquote romance. I always got them as friends, and maybe that has something to do with like having seen Clueless before reading the book too, where I was just like, I understand like this energy. But Frank is so like mean and just rude all the time. And I was definitely agreeing with Mr. Knightley at the end, like, poor Jane.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. I think that like when I was talking earlier about the Jane Frank kind of like my issue with that, I think this is like a big part of that. Like, and part of it too is that Jane doesn't have that strong of a presence. For some reason, I'm like always, one of the things that I like in like the book and the BBC adaptation is for some reason I'm really into like when Emma and Jane have a conversation at the end, and like that like kind of moment of realization for Emma. And this obviously doesn't have that. And like, that's fine. I'm not bitter or anything, but like it is sort of telling that they don't really go there, especially in relation to like the Frank of it all, where like in the book, I was happy for Jane. In the movie, I'm not happy for Jane.
Right.
And that just like never felt fully connected to me. And I think part of it is because they kind of used Frank to really bring out the worst of Emma. And that's a part of the book as well. But like they they're both kind of coming to terms with that in the book. I don't think in the movie he's coming to terms with anything.
Right. I also love, getting to see Emma and Jane Fairfax talk is like really, really delightful. We talked in the Pride and Prejudice episode about how we wish for like AU where Mrs. Bennett told Mr. Collins to propose to Mary is like, that's like the thing that I want. I like on this, like AU where Frank actually confesses when he almost confesses, and like then Emma serves as like his willing and like intentional beard when he gets back to town, like that. Because it would still get you to the same end, right? Because if she is behaving as though she's flirting with him, that would still get Mr. Knightley to realize, like, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But alas.
Alas.
Yeah.
So a big thing, which I don't think that you could do in a movie adaptation, but like a big thing in the book is like the way that Emma and Jane and Frank are kind of almost foils for each other because they all are missing a mom or or parents. Emma has her dad, but you know, people are always comparing the three of them, and then the way that Emma like reacts to each of them, she really doesn't like Jane, but then she falls immediately in with. So that whole like that dynamic I think was missing because all they gave Frank was a pretty face and fuckboy energy. So
one of the side characters that we haven't talked about that I really, really loved in this movie, this Mrs. Elton was perfect.
Yes.
She was, oh my God, that little shimmy in the dance scene. It's like she's in the background of the dance and and you can see her. Oh my God, this actress was so perfect. Mrs. Elton is always a character that like her scenes in the book are like painful for me to read because she sucks so much and she doesn't know she sucks, which I hate. And that's usually how I feel when watching her in an adaptation. And like this felt like it was still true. She still had all of that energy, but I had fun watching her. Like most of the laughs that this movie got out of me were related to her. She was perfect.
I 100% agree. It's one of the only, or maybe one of the few examples in which they did not like mean up a character. She's actually better. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, she still sucks. She still really sucks. But by the time that you get to the badly done, the Box Hill scene, and she's like, I'm not responding to this. I'm leaving. I'm like, you go ahead, girlfriend. Like I was agreeing with Miss Elton. I was like, what is happening right now?
That was actually what made me mad. I was like, I don't want to agree with her, but she's right.
Yeah.
And her outfits were astounding. Oh my God.
The hairstyles.
It was such a horror of finery.
Yeah, she makes the comment about like never wanting to like over accessorize or something. And I was like, yeah, totally. Like, you nailed it.
She went for a really understated look.
Did it take anyone else the entire movie to realize like what they knew Mrs. Weston from?
Oh no, I knew going in. I knew.
I like it was bothering me for so long.
Thank you. Yeah, the entire movie. Yeah, the entire movie. I was like, I know your face. I know your face. I don't know why.
Yes.
Game of Thrones.
One thing that really surprised me, I was like reading about the decoration for the house. Like they actually like got like a private estate, so they were able to like fully renovate it to like have those colors and everything. And apparently, like the husband or whatever, like who owns it, he decided he did not want it that way. The wife, she did want to keep it that way. And I was like, you should have divorced him so that you could keep that house that way. Because like, why would you ever go back?
Yeah, that whole movie was just so aesthetically pleasing. Like I would just want to like sit and bask in it. And like the florist, whoever is designing those flower arrangements, I need them in my life. It's all just so very calming and beautiful. I loved all of it.
I'm really curious about what Autumn de Wilde's going to direct next, because this was like her first feature movie. So like, I'm very intrigued.
Pride and Prejudice.
Yes.
Are we due for a new adaptation? Or
like, where is our like Marvel Cinematic Universe for just Jane Austen novels? Like, let's just work through them all, like, get them filmed.
I would love to see her take on Lydia, because Lydia is my favorite Bennett sister.
I'm ready for Autumn de Wilde does is every Austen. And on that note, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to Deboki and Jocelyn for joining us. If you are enjoying this podcast, we would love it if you consider joining our community on Patreon at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. We would also love to hear all of your thoughts on Emma, period, 2020. There will be a post dedicated to this episode of SnarkSquad.com, or you can find us on Twitter at @Snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at okidoki_boki.
I'm at Josseraptor.
This show is a Snark Squad production edited by me, and the music is by Stefan Chin.